Thank you for joining us.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So, again, our focus for this evening is going to be on faith and science integration. And so, to kind of help us get a bit more of the context for your own story, would you mind sharing a bit about your faith background? Did you grow up in a Christian home or not? Or, yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up in the United States in a Christian family, like many others in the United States, an immigrant family. So my mother was an American missionary in Guatemala, and my father grew up in the western highlands of Guatemala. And like many other Guatemalan Americans, my parents fell in love and got married during the Civil War and genocide. And actually, they expected to get married in the United States and head back to Guatemala to continue to serve Christians there. But for a variety of reasons, ended up staying in the United States after the wedding and ended up building a life here in the United States. And so I think growing up, I had parents who were like very committed to serving others, very committed to serving the church and serving Christ, and who also were in a little bit of a different culture from the one they expected to spend their lives in. And I had an amazing childhood where I got to tag along as they continued to serve and care for fellow Latino immigrants in Pennsylvania, where they still live.
So you had a great example growing up of what it means to sort of live out your faith through your parents.
I did, in so many different ways. I think of my mother who had the just love for people and still has the love for people to kind of meet people at their point of need and like move mountains to do so. And also my dad, who's a great inspiration, who I think is the first person in his family to get a high school degree. So he completed high school in his early 30s, and has been a remarkable explorer of American life and culture as he's taken on work in American industry and in factory work. And he just retired, in fact, last year. So it's been an amazing journey and a wonderful and weird opportunity for me as a kind of a white passing Latino Christian to kind of learn to appreciate and love many things about American Christianity, and also to be aware of a world beyond the borders of this country, and also aware of some of the areas of growth that American Christianity also has ahead of us.
That's a very interesting perspective to bring into this. Now, for different folks who grew up in a Christian home, sometimes you adopt the faith early on. Other times it's something that kind of is there, but it becomes something sparks it to become more your own at some point later. And others, decide not to follow, come back, or just never come back. What has been your experience in your own faith journey? How does that work out?
Yeah, so I think early on, I was very convinced of my own shortcomings and my own sin. And so that led me to kind of seek out Christ and the forgiveness that he offers us from a pretty early age. And I think like a lot of Christians who grew up in a Christian family, I had to ask questions about what that really meant for me as an individual as I was growing up. And I think, in my teenage years, there were certainly moments where, I was confronted with this question. Is this just something that is cultural, that I participate in because the people around me also test the values of Christianity? And what would it mean for me to really and truly live a life that follows Jesus? And I can remember, for me, I actually had some kind of terrifying moments where I imagined a life of kind of just doing what the people around me expected, and I was mildly terrified of the hypocrisy that might involve. And I can remember moments where I decided, as in the best of my ability, to follow Jesus with as much integrity as was possible. And those were some really key moments. I had a lot to learn and a lot to grow in, but some of those moments in kind of 16, 17, are moments that I point to as really fundamental moments in the arc of my life.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about your academic journey. How did you become interested in your current subject area? And I know you didn't start out there, or maybe you did. How about you just share with us how this interest came about?
Yeah, so I guess I can start when I was 13 or 14 was when I first encountered and started using a personal computer. So my parents had decided to home educate me and my brother, partly because there were values they cared about, but partly because of the racism that we were experiencing in a local Christian school. And my parents decided that was just something that my parents didn't want to put up with. And so I had this fascinating experience of being home educated in central Pennsylvania. I got to tag along with my mom as she was serving people in the community. She did a lot of translating and support for people who recently arrived in the United States and who had faced similar things to what our family had faced. And early into our time homeschooling, my parents scraped together the resources to get a IBM style PC that we could learn computing on. And we didn't really have the money for that much software. And I remember the guy at the computer store, because that's where you got your computer back then, kind of jokingly said, well, this computer comes with programming languages, and you could always make your own games. And I didn't know that he was joking. And so we went to the library, we got some books on programming. Over time, and together with my brother, learned how to make some really basic games like Pong and Breakout and things like that, and got really interested and obsessed in computers. And then of course I was insufferable, because my parents would say, all right, it's time for you to take chemistry or physics. And I would be like, why should I learn chemistry? Because computers are the future, and I'm really interested in this, and I should just spend more time programming. And never underestimate the I guess rhetorical and persuasive power of a dedicated mom. And my mom actually called on the phone. She opened up the phone book. She called the chair of the computer science department of a local college and said, please convince my son to study chemistry. This was a genius move, right? Because she knew that if she found a chemistry professor, that wasn't going to work. But if she found a computer scientist, that might do the job. I was 14 or 15 at the time. And so that's how I found my way into a computer scientist's office as a teenager. He asked me a bunch of questions, arranged for me to get a library card at the college library. And basically gave me a reading list of interesting things to read. And so I ended up spending much of my high school years, in addition to doing the regular homeschooling curriculum I was taking, just in the college library, wandering the stacks, reading interesting stuff, and loving every moment of it. Now, one of the things that Dr. Lee, who was that professor who ended up being a mentor for me for many years, told me when I landed in his office. He told me the story of when he was doing his very first computer science project as a grad student, which involved processing data from a nuclear reactor, which I was super impressed with that. It's still really cool. And he pointed out to me that computing is a lens on the world, right? That computers are useful because they help us understand other things. And that was enough to convince me to do chemistry. Understand chemistry and you'll be better at computing. But also it was a really helpful general piece of advice that insofar as I cared about computation, I should pay attention to a wider range of things. And later on in my teenage years where I had this kind of personal crisis of who I was and how that related to my faith, I felt profoundly that if I just focused on computing, that the things that really mattered in life to me as a person of faith, that mattered to me as a person who was trying to navigate my life as a part of an immigrant family in the United States, I would need to look outside of computing to really understand those things. And so I ended up doing 2 degrees in literature, first at Elizabethtown College, which was the college that my mom hauled me off to and that amazingly granted me library access. And then I got a scholarship to study literature and post-colonial literature at the University of Cambridge. From there, went into tech startups, helped start some charities, found my way to MIT, where I did my PhD to try to bring some of those things together. Realize that's a long and twisted tale, like many of our stories. But I think for me, I wasn't so sure that computing would be as central to what I would do in life, and I can't seem to escape it. And it's an important part of how I think, and it's become increasingly important to society. And so I really enjoyed taking up the opportunity and the responsibility of thinking through and being hopefully someone who makes consequential contributions to how society manages the implications of how computers are becoming part of everything we do.
One thing I want to focus on what you said. So you have a literature English degree background, and that wasn't accidental. It was part of your professor's advice to look at the world, since that's what computing helps you do. And often I hear that humanities is a helpful sort of lens or way of shaping the way we approach STEM stuff. Before I get to faith and how is the humanities bit influenced? I mean, I feel like I see some, but I'm curious what you would say in terms of that, like how it's affected.
Yeah, so I'm still figuring out the answer to the question of how the humanities have shaped my thinking and how I want them to and how I don't want them to. So first, I think it does relate to faith, right? As someone who grew up in a tradition that values narrative and arguments, and we have the text of the Bible that gives us such a literarily rich way of making sense of the universe and our lives. It's understandable that I would be drawn to literature and that way of seeing the world. And it was amazing to, from my first day in college, being given permission to read novels and think about other people and other places and times and how they made sense of the world and how they tried to cultivate visions of experience and share them with others. That was just an amazing experience to realize that I would be allowed by someone to do that all day. It was wonderful. I think on top of that, I learned to ask questions and be comfortable with complexity. And I think especially think about those things in relation to human experience and human values. That's something that you just can't escape if you're studying literature or other related humanities fields. And there have been times in history where literature has been a key part of essential movements in society. So if you think about, for example, the history of American feminism, for example. There's a period in American history. There have been times in right to assembly was substantially constrained. And so you would have women's literary societies and others where people would initially gather to discuss poetry and books and other things. And out of that, that's one of the streams that ended up feeding things like women's involvement in public health, in women's suffrage and things like that. And so whether it's in the history of the United States or other histories in the colonial history, art and literature have been an important part of society's capacity to make sense of the world and building up practices of freedom of expression that then mean something in terms of political power. And so, in my time at Cambridge, I ended up studying how people use media to build common understanding, to make sense of the world they're in, question the world they're in, and then build the power they need to build self-determination and hopefully, participation in democratic society. It doesn't always work as we hope, and the technologies people used in 1890s South Africa look more like printing presses than social media. But in many ways, some of the questions that I've asked more recently parallel some of those historical questions I ended up looking at.
Now to hone in a little more on the faith aspect of that, how would you say your faith has shaped your interest in the field and your research? You can, if you want, you can give a broad overview and then hone in, or however you feel more comfortable.
Yeah, so maybe first a few things about the research that I do today. So one way to talk about it is to think about my research as kind of behavioral consumer protection for the internet. So as tech companies put technologies into the world, we know that they interact with people in complex ways, and there are risks and benefits to that. Yesterday I talked about one of my, I think the clearest examples, which is work by Facebook recently to read all of our messages and watch all of our videos and determine who is at risk of suicide using machine learning models. And then intervene in people's lives, encouraging them to contact a suicide hotline or otherwise get support from their friends and family. And this could potentially save a lot of lives. This could be a breakthrough in public health. At the same time, it's also possible that it's costing lives. We don't have evaluations of the social and behavioral impacts of the things that Facebook is doing. And we do know that, particularly with some of these automated personal or assistants, things like Siri and Alexa and others, that audits of those systems in 2015 revealed that some of the things that those systems were doing in response to people disclosing suicidal ideation, some of those responses were the opposite of what clinical psychologists would encourage you to do. And so there are very real risks. And so the work that I've tended to do has looked at online harassment, discrimination. We're going to be doing an upcoming study on this idea that people are floating around phone addiction. around which there's not a lot of evidence, and trying to get causal evidence on like not only whether these concerns are real or not, but whether the best ideas we have for improving people's lives are working and how to, what interventions might work best. There's another side to the research, which also asks, how do we do this well in a democracy? Because every time we criticize Facebook or Google or Twitter or YouTube for some societal risk that we worry about, maybe it's influencing elections, which the jury's still out, or maybe it's like radicalization. Is this breeding, terrorists by feeding them more and more extreme content, or questions about the risk that people face from online harassment? Every time we raise these questions and challenge a company, the natural response is for that company to do something. And that means that we're asking companies to do more and more things that involve taking on power that sometimes we're not even sure we want to allow governments to have that kind of power. And so, and companies have even less accountability than governments on these kinds of things. In fact, we're still inventing the statistical and methodological systems we need in order to hold that kind of power to an account. And so the other half of my research asks, how can we redesign the statistics, the research methods, the whole way we do large-scale behavioral research to be more in line with the accountability and the involvement that a democratic society might expect. There's a longer conversation we can have about people actually who are connected to Northwestern University, people like Donald Campbell, who are pioneering thinkers on some of these questions when in the 1970s this was just a thought experiment, and now we're living in this world where companies are doing tens of thousands of behavioral experiments a year without our knowledge and accumulating behavioral power in ways that I would argue are leading us towards authoritarianism. So part of my work is doing this consumer protection research, evaluating the kind of power that's becoming possible through large-scale data collection and intimate intervention in people's lives. But the other part of this work is to ask, what contours of power actually are going to work for democracy if we want to have a free and fair society, and what kind of re-engineering of those systems might we need to do so that we live in an open society that we, would yearn for, at least, in countries like the United States and other democracies. So that's the kind of arc of my broader research. And in response to your question about where my faith comes in, for the most part, I do nonpartisan research. The organization that I lead doesn't favor any particular political party, any particular company. We actually, our funding streams are completely independent of industry. I've not tended to do research that is particularly inflected by faith in an explicit way. In many ways, the way that my kind of faith informs that is, are all the ways in which we see across the scriptures encouragements to serve the common good. And so, in fact, this study guide and report and discussion guide that we recently produced on artificial intelligence and Christianity is a very recent foray into speaking particularly to Christian groups. In the past, I've tended to do a lot more behind the scenes, either by supporting groups I care about logistically or administratively. I have some more kind of side projects that I'm exploring at the moment around helping Christian organizations to do behavioral research on broadening the diversity of funding towards underrepresented groups in Christian ministries. So doing more behavioral and psychological and economic style research to help broaden who's in ministry. But that work has tended to be kind of more of the side projects. But more recently, I've been just in the interests of understanding myself and looking for like where I can ground the public interest work I do in like a scriptural or theological understanding. One place I keep coming back to is the story in Acts 6, at the very beginning of the founding of the Christian church, where you have the apostles who've known Christ, who are like filled with the Spirit as much as anyone ever was, engaging in like grossly discriminatory practices based on like ethnicity and language. And we don't know why they were discriminating. Maybe they liked, the non-Greek speaking Christians better than the others. Maybe their networks were such that it took more work to find the like widows who were in need outside of their normal network. Maybe there were implicit biases. We have like language to talk about these things in ways that might have been tougher back then. But like there was a group of Christians who basically audited the apostles. And like I realize that audits sound really boring, but the result of their work to like audit and draw attention to this disparity from the apostles like was the thing that led the church to become an institution. Like you have the calling of the deacons, you have the selection of Stephen, you have this story that surfaces, one of the great evangelists of the Christian tradition and our first martyr. And so, when we think about like the role of quantitative research, when we think about the role of accountability and structures that not only grow the things we care about, but also restrain the power of the people we love and trust, that's a core part of the Christian story. And so I found a lot of encouragement in that, among many other parts of Scripture as I've done my work.
No, that's great. I mean, this idea of the Christian story that says that we, as one person would put it, that the world and we ourselves are more broken than we care to imagine, that is a realistic check and something that's easy to forget. So I think how that kind of helps you to frame like the way in which you're pursuing this stuff to make sure that we're not allowing ourselves to think we're free from potential abuses or even whether knowledgeable or unconscious and all that.
I got to spend my last year at MIT. I had the real treat of sharing an office with the journalist Matt Carroll. Matt is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. If you've seen the film Spotlight, then you've seen Mark Ruffalo playing my friend Matt in one of the greatest spreadsheet scenes of all cinema. Matt was one of the journalists who uncovered and wrote about the abhorrent sexual abuse of minors in the Catholic Church in America, and did the investigative reporting that confirmed that, and has done a great service to society and to Christianity by helping the church live up to its values through that external accountability. And so I have a deep respect for it, and have been lucky enough to spend quality time with other people who have played this, not always popular and very complicated role of, in some sense, being that prophetic voice, but in Matt's case, through data.
And so that was an interesting bit on how your faith has sort of shaped what you're focusing on, and the ways in which even your faith maybe helps you to realize your own potential influence in your research, and in some ways not to bring it in so directly. Like it's not the thing that you don't research things that are that would be, as you said, inflected by your faith, but you research things, the values of which, I'm curious though, how has your research then also informed your faith? How has it shaped it, critiqued it, complemented it?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I got my early training in the humanities, and there's something about how you see the world through stories and individuals that is incredibly revealing and helpful. But over time I realized that the issues I really cared about weren't just about individuals' experiences, but they had to do with like real things happening in the world that were affecting people. In my study of post-colonial literature, I kept on reading about like just morally frustrating and outrageous experiences that people have had in the past. And over time, I just said, I just can't like personally and morally commit myself to a life that's all about learning about things where I literally cannot intervene because they happened in the past. And that realization was one of the things that propelled me into more nonprofit and journalistic work. But also that kind of propelled me into more social science style research methods, because I started to realize that while single stories are really powerful and motivating, you can end up like carrying out substantial harm or misdirecting your energies or resources if you don't have a solid understanding of like the state of play across society or across a group. Over the time, I've spent more and more work and more time using quantitative methods, using ethnographic field work to look at, on average, or across a population or a particular sample, how is this particular issue playing out? What is the effect of this intervention? And that's ended up being a really kind of interesting opportunity for me to reorient some things about how I understand the kind of moral values that I have, or how I rethink ethics. I tended to think when I was a humanities student of like ethics and morality, largely in terms of individuals' decisions, and largely in terms of like interpersonal relationships at a small scale. Or I would look at some like system and think about it in terms of like the justice of that in terms of wider ideals or values. And in the work that I do now, I do a lot of counting. And I found that there are a lot of substantial like good to be done in the world through that kind of work. And that's led me to kind of revisit and rethink and ask, well, even as I see the world in very different ways, and construct moral and ethical and political initiatives and institutions that I hope will benefit people, I've had to restructure so many things about how I think and see the world, and that's absolutely an ongoing process about how I think about my things. At the moment, I feel like I see the world in very different ways, and construct moral and ethical and political issue in terms of like personal morality or interpersonal relations, when there are kind of wider structural and societal things at play where you might not notice them or understand them well unless you like were more purposive in what you look at. A classic example would be people's fears about the mistreatment of Christians in academia. Like there are some horror stories, and one person has a terrible experience, and that experience is genuinely terrible, and it gets picked up by various media outlets, and the next thing Christians are asking you and commiserating with you for like how terrible it must be to be constantly facing persecution for being a Christian, and they can't even imagine how a Christian might ever want to be in a non-Christian institution. And certainly those things happen, but when you look at only one story, right, the stories that bubble to the top don't tend to be the representative ones. And so I've had to like restructure my epistemology, which came from the amazing and helpful perspectives I gained in the humanities, but also, I guess, learn how not to be susceptible to the perils that also come with that.
That was all just a great example of faith interacting and shaping kind of where you're focused, but then also how it does also, your work then informs your faith, broadens it, helps you to see beyond maybe some categories that were a little narrow before. I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to open this up now, 2 questions from the audience, and then we can come back to some of my questions if there aren't too many. So, I see a hand over there.
So a question for me is what are the spiritual implications of AI technology? Just in terms of, you mentioned this algorithm that develops who you should pray for, and in the Bible it teaches us that there are these principalities and forces that don't want us to happen. So one is like, how does the spirit operate in these technologies, and how does the spiritual forces against us operate? And then just on a more personal level, what happens when people enter into virtual worlds or places like that where they may interact with people that they prefer to than in the real world?
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions in that. I think I'll pick 2 of them. So one question is like, what does it mean to relate to people virtually in a spiritual manner? I think we're now at a point where most people in the United States and a growing number of people elsewhere, relating people to people digitally is just relating to people. Like, there might be different kinds of like conditions under which we relate to others, but it's really difficult and probably impossible to draw any clear lines between like online and offline like people used to. And so I think it's important to just remember that as we figure out these questions. I think that one typical question that comes from maybe Christians who've lived in times where they can imagine not having the internet or not having like internet connected phones, they tend to think in those online, offline categories, and they tend to think of offline relationships as more meaningful than online ones. And pretty much almost the whole body of social science research on how people use digital technologies paints a more complex picture than that. We could say more about that, but I wanted to suggest that. And I think our challenge as people who are living with an ever-evolving set of technologies is that we're always renegotiating what relationships mean, what it means to have conversations with people. And hopefully, Christians will continue to grow our notion of what it means to have a Christian life and find new ways of blessing each other and blessing the world through that. I think, for example, of the relationships and conversations I have with my colleague in Namibia, Anisha Peters. Anisha is a computer scientist who teaches in a country where, at the University of Namibia, and find new ways of blessing each other and blessing the world through that. I think, for example, of the relationships and conversations I have with my colleague in Namibia and kind of peer support there. And we trade questions and talk about these issues in ways that, before, I guess academics have always had international networks, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the chances that Anisha and I would be able to share ideas and learn from each other and grow, or that even, like I was talking earlier outside of the film about the Emerging Scholars Network, a network of over 4,500 early career academics in all fields who support each other via the internet. That just wouldn't have been possible any other time. And so the potential for like realizing things that God has put into the world for us to do that were not possible before is vast and amazing, and we get to be explorers of that, and that's super exciting. I think that the question of like, how might AI and spirituality overlap? This is actually one of those areas where what we were talking about earlier around like how quantitative methods or like looking at the average or summarizing a population might lead you in different directions than just thinking about individuals. So a friend of mine, Christopher Lim, has an app called Ceaseless. And Ceaseless is designed to help you pray for your friends. And it's one of many prayer technologies that are out there. And when I say prayer technology, I don't just mean like a digital technology. When a church publishes a list of people to pray for, when you go to prayer meeting and someone decides who is going to get prayed for, like there's a procedure, there's some system in place that a Christian group or institution has in place to decide what to pray for. When you open up the sadly now defunct book, Operation World, this is something I was deeply disappointed to see struggle to sustain their funding model, because I think it was such an important resource. They had entries about what Christians are doing and what the state of the church is in every single country in the world. You're making a value judgment about who you should be praying for and why. When in the past, Christians would set aside large sums of money to construct monasteries where the monks would have a commitment to pray for certain people or for certain issues. When people organize 24/7 prayers, there's some theory about, some theology about why we pray and what it does for us, what it does for our relationship with God, what it does to our collective well-being, and also there are beliefs that we have about what God will do in the world. And so those are all values that Christians have disagreed on over the years, and which people have built into their institutions over the long history of Christianity, built into their media, whether it's print, whether it's television, whether it's the weekly email I get from my church. Artificial intelligence systems are already shaping the collective human offering of prayer that we have now. Like if you think about the news, that the way the news shapes what people pray for, there are certain things we see in our Facebook news feeds, and I would bet you that if you did a study where you looked at the contents of prayers in the front of churches in the United States, and you looked for a correlation between the news that trended on Facebook and what churches pray about in their services, I think it's a plausible hypothesis that the Facebook newsfeed is driving some proportion of American Christian prayer. When you're in a conflict situation and Facebook is only showing you news from your faction in that conflict, it's going to be harder for you to understand and pray for the people who might even be Christians on the other side of that conflict. And so, proportion of American Christian prayer. When you're in already shaping what we're thinking about, who we're praying for, how we're approaching those prayers, and whether you're building an app like my friend Chris, or whether you're asking what impact something like Facebook's news algorithms have on spiritual life. That's just one example. And an example where whether we're builders of systems, critics of systems, there's an important conversation to be had.
We're going to pause here.